If you're still not understanding light and wondering what on earth is Jerry teaching me right now, oh my God, I'm just so confused with the inverse square law. How does it all work? And God forbid Jerry actually talks about lighting ratios. You know what? I am going to talk about lighting ratios, but I'm actually going to share it with you as I feel like I want to be a responsible teacher, but then I'm going to simplify it dramatically. So I'm going to come to what this actually means. Liquid light, what does that mean? First of all, let me discuss lighting ratios. So you may have actually heard about lighting ratios, but what do they actually mean? And why is it almost irrelevant when it comes to today's photography when you're actually photographing digitally and so on? Now, what you must understand is back in the old days, and I feel old when I talk about this, but back in the old days when you used to shoot with film and you did not have a Polaroid back, so when you shoot with film, you could actually have a Polaroid, like the Polaroid cameras, the Polaroid back, take a photograph and actually see an idea of what your photograph was going to appear like and look like. Well, of course, now with digital, and especially with mirrorless cameras, you can actually see live what everything is doing in your camera, and it's just so easy. It's ridiculously easy. Lighting ratios were important back in the day because you needed to know, well, what kind of look do you want? Do you want it very, very light over here and quite dark on here? Let's say the light is coming from this direction, causing a shadow over this side. What difference do I want on the highlight side and the shadow side? Because I can sort of see it in my camera, but I don't really know until I take that photograph. Certainly when you're photographing with flash, you're using a modeling light, arguably, to sort of see where that light is falling, but you are not going to get the contrast of when that flash hits the subject. So understanding ratios back in the day is arguably more important. What I'd rather and prefer you to understand is just understand, well, what do I like? What do I feel? What looks good? I don't really care about saying, I want to achieve this ratio today. I'd rather you say, I want to achieve this look and feel today based upon your instinct and your gut and what works. But I feel like if I'm teaching a bit about lighting, I feel like I want to touch upon what ratios mean, but then I'm going to simplify it very, very dramatically for you. So what are lighting and contrast ratios? Well, it's ultimately the difference between the value of light on the shadow side and the highlight side of your subject. Or it could be a mountain, doesn't really matter, it's the same sort of thing. So let's discuss it in a little bit more detail. So what we're talking about now is the difference between a main light, they call it a main light, a key light, or a fill light, okay? So one is just filling in detail. One's illuminating me sort of all over. And then one is actually creating the accent, the key light, the main light. This is giving me what I'm basically trying to say. So again, ratios are the difference of intensity, the f-stops, of your main light and your fill light, which is the difference between the highlights and the shadows. It's basically a measure of contrast on your subject. So you may have heard what a 1-to-1 ratio is. It's basically meaning that your fill and main light are the exact same output of light. In this case, we've given you an example, f11, f11. That's what basically we're saying. If you don't know what I'm talking about, it's simply we have the same power of light here and the same power of light there. It's flat, it's even. That's a 1-to-1 ratio. A 2-to-1 ratio is, for example, where your main light is f11 and your fill is, say, for example, f8. So it basically depends on what you're looking for. If you're looking for that a little bit of shadow on that one side and light on the other side, that difference is not so great. And as you go further in the ratios, the more dramatic that contrast between highlight and shadow is. Now, if I've confused the hell out of you, and I probably have, as I was confused when I first learned photography, or arguably you may be an experienced photographer and you're just reinventing yourself, filling up some holes in your knowledge, whatever the case may be, I want to talk about lighting with an understanding that light is like water. It behaves like water. Let me explain. Here we have, if we liken light to water, for example, if we have, let's say, a small hose and I had it on my face and that hose was hitting me, would that actually feel sharper on my skin, harder on my skin, or softer on my skin? Well, yes, it depends on the water pressure, but let's just say there's a constant water pressure, it's sort of fairly even. It's not just sort of drooping out like, you know how you'd turn the tap and get the hose as kids when you're playing in the backyard and you would just drink from the hose. Well, I'm talking about some decent water pressure. And if I had a small size of water on my face, that would feel sharper on my face and my cheek. If I, for example, had a little bit bigger shower head rather than a small one, that will feel a little bit softer. If I had one of those, when you go to a hotel room and they have those really luxurious sort of rain ceilings, that feels softer because it's enveloping me completely. In other words, where the water touches me, that's where the light is touching me. Where it's not, that's where the shadows are. That's where I'm not getting wet. Does that make sense? So whenever you are thinking about light and you're thinking, Jerry talked about lighting ratios, Jerry talked about the inverse square law, I'm just not getting it. Well, let's just talk about it in the sense of water. Trust me, you will understand light like this. Ready? So here we see we've got a half, 1, 2, 3, 4. We've got 4.5 shower heads, basically illuminating this wallpaper. We have the bride here with her back on the wall. She's bringing her body a little bit further out. Why is she doing that? Because if, let's say, she had her body completely against the wall and she had a bigger bust, then the water would only hit her bust and the bust would cause a shadow on the rest of her body. In other words, it would be like a veranda, so to speak. The water would actually hit her face, hit her bust, and not hit the rest of her body. Now, yes, you could liken it to a waterfall and it'll eventually get there, but light does not behave like that. We've already discussed that light travels in straight lines. It's not going to go there and wrap around and everything. Yes, light can bounce and all those different things, but ultimately this water, the light, is hitting her face, not the shadow side, therefore that's dry, and it's hitting her chest and little parts of her body. And of course you can see where the water is actually not hitting the wallpaper, therefore that's where the shadow is. You have to liken light to water and you'll completely understand how to shape it, because when we think of light, it's almost not tangible. When you think of water, well, you can drink water, you can put it on your face, you can have a water fight, you can dunk yourself into it. That is what light really is. It's all around us, and once we understand that light is like water, again, we can shape it. Let's look at this, for example. We've got a little bit of a soft spray of water, so to speak, on here. We've got detail everywhere. You see a little bit more water here, and that little evidence of water here, which basically means that we have a light source behind them. An extra shower head is hitting. Now, we don't see this light source we don't see from here. So in other words, the difference between highlight and shadow is not so great because the water pressure is hitting her on the face and his face, and there's a little bit more coming over here, therefore the contrast. On the back of her neck, there's a little bit of water coming from behind the actual frame, as in light, and therefore we get this beautiful feel. So it's important to know that in situations like this, for example, you've probably heard of the word vignette, where basically we're darkening the edges around a frame and it's a little bit darker, so we're focusing our eye on the attention of where we want the viewer to look at, depending on what we're doing. So in this case, what I wanted to do is I wanted less water on her forehead and the side of her face, and I wanted the water only on her eyes and her nose and her lips and part of her body and so on. So I got her to actually just recess a little bit more into that car, just so we get less water, less light on her face. Again, you must think of it like water. So, for example, if I have a shower head like this, okay, so we have a shower head like that, and then light, as we've discussed, travels in straight lines. Now, often our instinct is to put our subject right in the firing line so they can get wet completely. Well, what happens if I want to create drama and mood and texture and depth, dimension and form? Well, I might put my subject, of course you're looking at a bird's eye view, I might put my subject on the fringe of that light. What's been popularised over the years is feathering, where I put my subject in a position where they're getting that residual water, that residual spray of water, that light. And therefore now, and depending on my angle and depending on where they stand in proportion in relation to where I am, we can get a completely different look. Let's show you again. Let's liken this to water. Now we have this big shower head. We have this big shower head. Therefore, the photograph is quite soft. The way she's standing, now we do have a bit of shadow. Light is hitting her on the arm. We've got a shadow basically over here and on the middle of her back there as well. But you can see that little hint of highlight on her shoulder blade here and the small of her back. So it's soft, but there's also depth and mood and dimension and form.
I couldn't hear what you said.
So I said a name that sounded like Apple's, I'm not going to say the name, and she's on Do Not Disturb, but she thought I was saying her name and that's why she interrupted us, but life is good. All right, so again, shadow over here, big shower head. What the actual water can see, of course, is where it's going to be wet, where it's going to be lit, where it's not, that's going to be in shadow. Now, let's look at a small light source. Now, you might think, well, wait a second, is this off-camera flash? What is it? There looks like some backlight. Well, what's happening is the sunlight, being a smaller light source, is actually illuminating her from behind, or it's like drenching her from behind. And as a small light source hitting her on the back of the head, it's ricocheting, the water, the light is ricocheting on a reflector, and it's actually a silver reflector. So think of silver as stainless steel. Do you think water will actually ricochet more on stainless steel rather than plasterboard or something like that, or a normal painted wall? Well, yes, of course. It's going to be a little bit contrasty and sharper off a stainless steel wall. So I liken my silver reflector to stainless steel. I liken light to water. So therefore, we've got water hitting the back of her, water hitting the stainless steel and back on her. So now it's a small light source, being the reflector, and it's ricocheting, and that's what we get. Now, watch what happens when the light, same girl, the sunlight hits the clouds. Now, think of light like being through a strainer, and we're diffusing and we're spreading the light further and further and further, and therefore we're getting a little bit of a softer, more diffused look than we would get in this one. Remember, light is exactly like water. I can't think of almost any situation where that analogy or metaphor of light being like water that doesn't actually work. This one, we have a similar effect. We've got the sunlight hitting the back of her. On this side, we have this huge white wall. It is big. It's a big light source, although it started off small, as in the sun is a small light source, and yes, it has so much power. In other words, we've got a small hose with so much pressure, it's ricocheting off this white wall, and now it's spraying light everywhere, and therefore the transition between light and shadow is not so great. Does that make sense? So you really have to, again, whenever you're stuck and you're freaking out and think, wait a second, where do I want to wet the face? Where do I not want water? Well, of course, you would turn the face a certain way. And that's what it's like. So for me, when I photograph a person, usually, I'm not saying this is an absolute, but usually what I would do, if I have my light source over here, I would turn the face away from the light and turn my face until this eye socket gets wet. Once I do that, light hits the side of my face. I've got the bridge of the nose, which allows a pocket of light to actually illuminate my socket, the eye socket. Why I say eye socket, I don't want to just say the eye, because you might not actually illuminate the total eye socket. And I turn the face until the eye that was furthest away from the camera is actually now the closest. And then now I create a shadow side of the face, often referred to as the narrow side or the short side. And that gives me no moisture, as in it's not wet on this side. That's where the shadow is. Make sense? Here we have full sun. I want water on her face. I want water on the background, but I don't want any water, so to speak, on the background to actually show the shape and the shadow of that crown. And you see how there's no water actually hitting the bottom of her eyes because she's got these eyelash extensions on. We've got no water, so to speak, or very little water on the upper part of her bottom lip That gives us that beautiful sort of wing shape, and it's just beautiful. And of course, there's no water on the bottom of her neck, but that gives us these strong depth, dimensions, and shape and form, and it's really contrasty. But remember, we've got a small light source, lots of pressure, which means there's more contrast. Simple. This is open shade. So this is basically an open door of this house, and then we've got basically a flood of light coming in. Yes, most outdoor light is basically sunlight or moonlight, but once it's diffused through clouds or once it's diffused with something overhanging, then it now becomes a flood. So rather than, let's say, for example, it being direct sunlight, rather than it being just with clouds, now we've got the light sort of spraying and bouncing and then flooding underneath the veranda, hitting this couple. So now we have a soft quality of light. We have a softer transition from highlight to shadow, as in most of them are, their bodies and the clothes and the environment, most of that environment is wet. Make sense? All right, let's keep on going with a couple more examples. Here, you've got sort of light being sprayed everywhere at the background. This is basically some DJ lights, some atmospheric lights and all that kind of stuff that the coordinator had placed. This is at the end of a long night, and what I've done to illuminate these guys is a handful of candles. So what we're doing is we're putting a shower head right down below and we're spraying the couple up this way. In other words, we're spraying right up the nose. The light, the water does not hit the upper cheekbones. That's very unflattering, and so on and so forth. So if I want my couple to get wet on the face, I have to actually get them to lean a little bit, lean towards that shower head, that light source, to get lit or wet. Does that make sense? So again, remember, you just have to liken light to water to understand how to shape it. Let's look at this example. So now we've got little fountains in the background. Candles become like little mini fountains. They're just spraying water out. Not too much. There's not much pressure. It's pretty much got a little bit of water here, and there's a little bit of spray of light illuminating and a glow around them. We've got some accent lights and sconces on the wall and so on. I needed some light, some water to spray on their faces. So what do? I actually get the ice light, and that's a continuous LED light source that I actually invented myself personally. I've actually got the groom holding that light, holding that shower head, or sprinkler, whatever you want to call it, and he's holding it behind. And what's happening is that we've got light mainly hitting her, but it's ricocheting off her face and hitting him a little bit. That's why we have that soft little glow of light around him. So remember, just think of it like light. What about this? We've got a strong hose. This is the DJ light. There's a strong hose going right on their faces, and actually water is passing them on the ground. You can see water being sprayed, and you know that I'm saying all this in inverted commas here, is being sprayed by those DJ lights everywhere. Now, why do we get light between their faces? Because what's happening is, if water, let's say for example, me and Melissa are here, my wife and I are right here, and water was behind us, well, it would basically ricochet off both of us and just splatter this way. Therefore, we would get a little bit wet, so to speak, on the face. Same thing that we're doing here. We don't get complete water or light in front of them. Of course, that was just some ambient fill that was there, but that's what makes me know how to actually shape it. So guys, hopefully that's given you enough example there to really understand how to shape the light. Now we're going to go further into different kind of qualities of light and shapes of light, and what's commonly used at a wedding, what do we need to know, all those different things. Now, yes, you could totally ignore and never watch a part of the bundle there that discusses lighting ratios or the inverse square law ever again, as long as you understand those fundamentals and why we need to know them. But ultimately, if you forget everything that I've actually mentioned so far in this lighting course, remember that light is like water, and once you understand that, you know how to shape it. Where the light hits the subject, that's where the person gets wet. Where it doesn't, that's where the person doesn't get wet, as in that's where the shadow is. Hope you enjoyed that. Hope that makes you understand everything. And remember, you're in trouble. Think of it like water, and you'll be free of the algebra of lighting.